This video is going to take us through the process of aerobic respiration. But before we get into it, I'd like to review glycolysis, which was in a previous video. Glycolysis takes glucose and makes pyruvic acid, or pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon compound. So glucose, a 6-carbon compound, breaks down, decomposes into pyruvic acid. During this process, a net of 2 ATP are made and 2 NADH. And note the 2 pyruvic acid because you had 6 carbons in glucose and 3 carbons in each pyruvic acid, so you need 2. So we have not lost any carbons yet. After pyruvic acid, there's a choice. If there is no oxygen, you start anaerobic respiration or fermentation. If there is oxygen, you go to the mitochondria. Glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm because glucose is too big to just diffuse into the mitochondria, so you need to use energy. So that you are more efficient, they break it down into pyruvic acid, which can easily diffuse into the mitochondria, and away we go. So the mitochondria, to again review, has your outer and inner membranes. The inner membranes has what's known as the ETC, the electron transport chain, and an enzyme that makes ATP. The matrix is the fluid inside. Those have enzymes for the Krebs cycle. And then the outer membrane determines what goes in and out. So it allows pyruvic acid in, but it does not allow glucose. Hence, glycolysis takes place in your cytoplasm. So aerobic respiration overview occurs with oxygen. It's when the pyruvic acid moves into the mitochondria and creates a lot more ATP and begins with your Krebs cycle. So that is where we will start with the entire process. Remember, the overview of cellular respiration is decomposing or oxidizing glucose to make ATP. So what the Krebs cycle actually does is it completes the decomposition and oxidation of glucose into carbon dioxide. It is also known as the citric acid cycle, which you will see later on why. So this is the big picture of it. It occurs with oxygen, and as you see, one of the compounds is called citric acid, hence why it is known as the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. And a major component of this is the pyruvic acid going in, and because per glucose molecule you make 2 pyruvic acids, you need 2 cycles. So as we're going through this, realize that per glucose molecule this occurs twice. So the entire process, all it's doing is oxidizing the carbon compound to produce NADH, FADH2, and ATP, which are energy carriers. So to break it down, before you actually enter the Krebs cycle, the pyruvic acid needs to react with coenzyme A in order to make acetyl-CoA and NADH, and a CO2 is lost. So if you follow the carbons throughout this whole thing, pyruvic acid had 3 carbons. You lost a carbon through carbon dioxide, and therefore acetyl-CoA has 2 carbons. So this is what enters your Krebs cycle. Step 2 in this whole process is when the acetyl-CoA combines with the oxaloacetic acid, which has 4 carbons in it, or also known as OAA, and makes a 6-carbon citric acid cycle. So if you follow the cycle idea, you will realize that we have to end up back to the 4-carbon OAA. So you keep that in mind as we go through each step. But in this step, the 2-carbon acetyl-CoA combines with the 4-carbon OAA and the 6-carbon citric acid. And also, because coenzyme A is an enzyme, obviously, it needs to be regenerated so that it can go and combine with another pyruvic acid and bring another pyruvic acid into this cycle. Because remember, this is all due to enzymes. So step 3, citric acid is oxidized and loses a carbon dioxide, and in that process, the NAD plus is reduced to NADH. So we now have a 5-carbon compound known as ketoglutarate. You don't really need to focus on the names other than citric acid, but they're fun names to learn. So if that helps you, go for it. So that is step 3. Step 4 is when ketoglutarate, the 5-carbon compound, is oxidized again, releasing a carbon dioxide. So you're down to 4 carbons, and NAD plus is reduced producing another NADH. So if you're counting carbons, you'll realize we don't want to lose any more carbons. So these will just, from here until the end, all we're going to be doing is reducing NAD plus or FAD or other things in order to oxidize the 4-carbon compound to bring it back to OAA. So step 5, as I said, the 4-carbon is oxidized, making your ATP, your FADH2, and your NADH, and it recycles the OAA back. So the complete outcome of Krebs cycle, you produce 1 CO2 in the pyruvate to acetyl-CoA and 1 NADH in that process as well. In the actual cycle, you produce 2 carbon dioxides and 3 NADHs and 1 FADH2 and 1 ATP. But because you have 2 pyruvates per glucose, you end up with actually 6 CO2, which is, if you remember the equation, back to the equation, you end up with 6 CO2, 8 NADH, 2 FADH2, and 2 ATP. So if you're looking at this, total now, net total of ATP at this point is only 4. 4 is not a lot of ATP to get out of glucose. So what's going to happen now is those NADHs and FADH2s have to be converted into ATP. And so that happens the electron transport chain. If you want to pause it now and look at this table a little closer, there's more to come in this realm. Sometimes this is useful because it's all color-coded, but just to focus on the total output are the green, and you have 4 ATP from glycolysis, 2 CO2s from acetyl-CoA, 2 ATPs from the Krebs cycle, and 4 CO2s from the Krebs cycle as well. So total of 6 CO2s and net total of 4 ATP. But now, if you count up the NADH, you have 10 NADH and 2 FADH2 that are now going to move on to the electron transport chain. Now, the electron transport chain is in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, so very convenient that the Krebs cycle occurs in the mitochondrial matrix, so they're right there for the inner membrane. And it's made up of cytochromes, which are basically just easily reduced and oxidized enzymes. And what it does is it going to take the NADH and FADH2, take the electrons out of there, and convert them into ATP. There's an animation on this that fully describes the whole process in the 3D version. So for a further electron transport chain explanation, you can go to that video. But this is the basic picture of it. And you'll see that the electrons move through the enzymes from the NADH. And as they're moving through, very similar to the light reaction of photosynthesis, hydrogen ions are pumped. The hydrogen ions are pumped into the intermembrane space between the inner and outer membrane of the mitochondria. That's another bonus of them having the double membrane. And that creates the concentration gradient for the ATP synthase to work. So chemoosmosis comes into play again and makes ATP. You'll also notice that at the very end is where oxygen is actually used, because if you hadn't realized oxygen hadn't been used yet. So oxygen is what's known as the final electron acceptor, and it takes the electrons out of the cytochromes, combines with the hydrogen ions, and produces water. So if you look at this whole process, oxygen is extremely important, because if it wasn't there, the electrons would just get backed up, and there wouldn't be any room for any more. It's kind of like if a whole bunch of cars go down a one-way street that is blocked at the end. They can't move because nothing is there to accept them or move them. Oxygen allows that movement, so it allows electrons to continue flowing. So if you also look at this a little further, you'll notice 1 NADH equals 3 ATP, and 2 FADH2 produce 2 ATP. So if you remember, 10 NADH will make 30 ATP, the 2 FADH2 make 4 ATP, so the total ATP from the electron transport chain is 34. Way more than from the Krebs cycle and glycolysis. So if we look at the whole process, the overall make is 38 ATP, 6 CO2, and 6 water. if you remember the whole thing. So if you look at this, it is the complete picture. Again, if you would like to pause and go through every little step, feel free. But what I want to make sure you notice is the fact that most cells actually need 2 ATP to bring your NADH from glycolysis into the mitochondria. So therefore, you end up with a total of 36 overall ATP, not 38. But if you remember, to bring the 2 NADH2, those will actually eventually make 6 ATP, so it is actually smart to bring those extra NADH in from glycolysis. And this gives you a whole 66% efficiency instead of the 3.5 of anaerobic. So aerobic is much more efficient than anaerobic. And then if you want the simplified version, there you go, with no crazy stuff, just the net energy at the end of 2 ATP from glycolysis, 2 from the Krebs cycle, and 34 from the ETC. So a total of 38, but don't forget those -2 for the NADH to come in. So this is how everybody functions, but everyone is slightly different. We have what's known as facultative aerobes, obligate anaerobes, and obligate aerobes. And these are 3 different types of organisms that are classified by how they cell respirate. Facultative aerobes are pretty good because they can actually switch between aerobic and anaerobic. The thing is, if you remember, the efficiency is not as great with anaerobic, but they are able to survive. Obligate anaerobes are actually poisoned by oxygen. These were huge in early Earth conditions, so they were probably very prevalent before anything else. Obligate aerobes, which is what we are, cannot survive very long without oxygen. We can go through anaerobic respiration, so it does not mean that you can't go through anaerobic respiration, but you cannot survive off of anaerobic respiration. So that is what we are. And then lastly, some various interesting facts with cell respiration. First one is your stress hormone, epinephrine, actually preps you to run by getting it ready to cell respirate faster. So when you pump yourself up for a game or a race, you're actually secreting the epinephrine and actually prepping your body to respirate faster and be more efficient. Fats and proteins can be used instead of carbs in cellular respiration, but they can't go through glycolysis because it's not glucose. You can't break down glucose well, you can only break down glucose in glycolysis, not amino acids or fatty acids. So it cannot happen without oxygen. So those of you who do a lot of anaerobic respiration, you're building muscle, but you generally during that exercise are not burning fat. What ends up happening is you have more muscle, so your metabolism increases. So throughout the day, you are using more energy, and therefore that is why there's weight loss. But if you want to go strictly by cell respiration, only carbs can go through aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Cell respiration also helps you stay warm, which sounds pretty basic, but I think is interesting because a lot of organisms have adapted to have mitochondria that actually produce more thermal energy and less ATP to help them keep warm. This is how they hibernate, and some plants actually use this to make themselves smell to attract flies for pollination. So like skunk cabbage, the way they actually smell so much is by producing more heat energy instead of ATP. And then this just gives you the overall picture of the glucose going through glycolysis, making pyruvate in the cytoplasm, and then the pyruvate either goes to lactic acid fermentation or goes into the mitochondria to go to the citric acid or Krebs cycle, which produces your CO2, which gets sent out, and your NADH and FADH2, which go to your electron transport chain, which produce the most ATP, as well as take in your oxygen or use the oxygen and release water. So this gives you the big picture, and hopefully it will now kind of all make sense and you can relate all of the little pieces together. If you can't, continue to review and look over, and you will hopefully eventually grasp the concept, but focus on the carbons, the oxidation, the reduction, and the step-by-step process of cellular respiration.